5:43 a.m. Ravenna, Ohio. A cul-de-sac on the east side of town, still dark, 29 degrees. Frost on the windshields. No traffic. This was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened, the kind where you could run something invisible. Small houses with detached garages, chain-link yards, people who worked early shifts and minded their business. The investigators had no reason to watch it. At the end of the block, behind a chain-link fence, a low tin-roof garage with a rolling steel door. Hand-painted sign above it read, Buckeye Cycle Resale. Used bikes, discount prices. The kind of operation that fits into any Rust Belt neighborhood without anyone looking twice. At 5:43, 6 vehicles turned onto the street simultaneously from both ends. No lights. 41 seconds later, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Portage County Drug Unit, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol were in position. 32 agents. A K-9 unit staged at the alley exit. A DEA forensic team with a cutting torch at the curb. The vehicles had been staged 4 blocks away since 5:15, engines running low, agents in full tactical gear despite the cold, watching a thermal feed from a camera the DEA had accessed 3 days earlier. The feed showed 2 heat signatures inside the garage, both stationary, both consistent with people asleep. The rolling steel door came down at 5:44. Inside, 41 finished children's bicycles hung on the wall in 2 rows, painted primary colors, price-tagged and ready for shipment. 17 more frames on welding jigs mid-assembly. A 5-gallon spray paint booth in the corner still warm to the touch. Fluorescent lights. A folding table near the south wall held measuring calipers, a torque wrench, a digital scale, a vacuum seal apparatus. On a pegboard above it, a laminated production checklist hung from a single nail, filled out in pencil, row by row. The garage smelled like acetone and fresh powder coat. One detail stopped the DEA's lead technician the moment he walked through the door. The bikes were too heavy. What you're about to hear is the reconstruction of a 9-month federal investigation that cracked open inside a Youngstown warehouse at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in December. Not because an informant talked. Not because a surveillance camera caught the right face. Because one man, pushing a pallet-jack through a cross-dock facility, lifted a case of boxed bicycles and felt something wrong. Something that didn't match the paperwork. That feeling, a few extra pounds on a wooden pallet, would lead directly to the garage on the cul-de-sac in Ravenna. To the welding jigs. To the powder coat booth still warm at dawn. To 11 kilograms of fentanyl powder sealed inside the seat tube and top tube of every finished frame. 200 bikes a month moved through this operation. Each one routed through the same distribution channel that carried children's Christmas inventory to discount retailers across the eastern seaboard. Here is how they built it. And here is how a weight mismatch on a pallet dismantled it. Buckeye Cycle Resale had operated on the Ravenna cul-de-sac since spring 2024. Business registration with Ohio. A tax ID. A supplier agreement with a mid-tier regional discount retail chain that bought used and refurbished toys and sporting goods for clearance resale. Buckeye sourced BMX-style children's bicycle frames from secondary markets, refurbished them, and delivered them palletized to the retailer's Youngstown distribution hub. From there, inventory flowed east to store locations in Pennsylvania, western New York, and West Virginia. The retail chain was legitimate. Its purchasing team dealt with dozens of small regional suppliers. Buckeye was one vendor among many, consistent with delivery schedules, compliant with labeling, priced competitively enough that nobody asked hard questions. That was the design. Behind the supplier registration and the handshake retail contract, federal investigators determined that Buckeye Cycle Resale was a front operated by a cell with structural links to the Sinaloa network's northeastern logistics arm. The cell had identified a specific vulnerability. The toy and juvenile sporting goods category moves enormous volume in the final quarter of the year. Warehouses get overwhelmed. Cross-dock throughput triples between October and December. Individual items receive minimal inspection at the pallet level. A case of bicycles gets weighed at intake, scanned, and staged for outbound distribution. Nobody opens a sealed case of children's bikes and measures the frame tubing. The concealment method was precise. Fentanyl powder, compressed into standard pharmaceutical bricks, was packed into the hollow interior of the bicycle's seat tube and top tube before final welding. Each tube was then welded shut at both ends, the seam ground smooth, and the entire frame run through a powder coat cycle. The paint concealed the weld seam. A finished frame was visually indistinguishable from any standard BMX frame. At roughly 8 to 10 pounds per unit, 11 kilograms of fentanyl per bike added meaningful mass. But the shipping manifest was calibrated to account for it. The paperwork said 6 bikes per case. The weight listed matched the actual loaded weight. As long as nobody compared that weight to what 6 unmodified frames actually weighed, the discrepancy was invisible. The cell had been running this since October 2025. By mid-December, they had moved an estimated 3 shipments of 200 units each, delivering product to a downstream distribution network operating out of multiple cities across the Northeast. What strikes us about this case is the patience. This was not an improvised method. Somebody spent real time developing a concealment that was functionally immune to visual inspection, calibrated the paperwork against the actual payload weight, and embedded the entire operation inside a legitimate retail supply chain that law enforcement had no reason to watch. The sophistication suggests the cell had institutional knowledge of how regional distribution hubs handle seasonal inventory. That knowledge came from somewhere. Before the investigation found its footing in Ravenna, it had to establish what it was actually looking at. In the days following the initial flag, while the Portage County Drug Unit worked the business registration, the DEA's Cleveland field office ran a background check against every name associated with the supplier agreement. The registered agent on the Ohio filing was a woman in her 60s, whose name appeared on 14 similar filings across 3 counties, all registered in the same 18-month window. A professional nominee, someone who lent her name to entity registrations for a fee, with no actual connection to the business. It was a clean buffer. Her signature was real. Her involvement was nil. Her name on paper created distance between the cell and anything a routine record search would surface. The phone numbers tied to the registration were prepaid devices activated in August 2025 from a cell tower in Akron. One of them made a total of 11 calls in the 4 months since activation. All 11 went to a single number, another prepaid device, Akron registered, with average call duration under 90 seconds. Whoever operated these phones communicated in short bursts, likely coordinating logistics, and they were not making mistakes. The communication discipline told investigators they were not dealing with an improvised operation. The drug unit's lead investigator, Agent Caldwell, spent 3 days sitting with this profile before the magnet test gave him something harder to work with. During those 3 days, he drove past the Ravenna cul-de-sac twice in an unmarked vehicle. He did not stop. He noted the hours the rolling door was raised, the number of vehicles on the property, the positioning of the security camera mounted above the garage door at an angle, covering the full width of the approach. The camera was wired, not wireless. That detail mattered. Someone had invested in the infrastructure. This was not a garage someone was using temporarily. On the night of December 9th, 2025, a pallet-jack operator named, for this reconstruction, Marcus worked the overnight shift at the Youngstown cross-dock facility. His job was straightforward: move inbound pallets from receiving to staging lanes, scan each pallet's barcode, and confirm the physical weight against the manifest weight using the dock's floor scale. Marcus had worked overnight at this facility for 4 years. He knew the weight of product the way experienced handlers always do, not through the scale alone, but through the accumulated physical memory of moving the same categories of goods hundreds of times. Pallets of boxed bicycles had a particular feel, a predictable resistance. He had moved Buckeye pallets before. He had moved them through multiple shifts across 3 months of deliveries. The Buckeye shipment came in at 2:17 a.m. 3 pallets, each containing 8 cases of 6 bicycles. 44 units per pallet, per the paperwork. Marcus ran the first pallet across the floor scale. Weight confirmed. Scanned and staged. The second pallet crossed the scale. Confirmed. Staged. On the third pallet, Marcus pulled his jack forward and felt it before the scale gave him a number. A slight resistance. Not dramatic, nothing that would have stopped most people. Just a few extra pounds distributed across a wooden pallet that was supposed to hold the same thing as the other 2. The scale confirmed the weight was 12 pounds over the manifest figure. 12 pounds on a pallet of bicycle cases that had been moving through this dock for 3 months without a single variance. Marcus set the pallet down. He looked at the cases. He looked at the scale readout. He walked to the foreman's office. Most people assume a discrepancy like this gets logged as a clerical error and cleared by morning. The evidence tells a different story. Marcus's foreman, a 16-year veteran of distribution logistics, recognized the significance immediately. Not because he suspected narcotics, because a weight variance on a supplier who had never had one across dozens of previous deliveries was worth escalating. The foreman called the retail chain's loss prevention line at 2:26 a.m. The loss prevention duty officer took the call, logged the variance, and by 4 a.m. had flagged the case for follow-up. By 9 a.m. on December 10th, a loss prevention supervisor had pulled Buckeye's full delivery history. 37 prior deliveries. 36 had weighed within 1 pound of the manifest figure. The 37th, the pallet Marcus had flagged, was the outlier. She called the Portage County Drug Unit at 10:14 a.m. Agent Caldwell pulled the business registration within the hour. Clean surface. No priors. The retail supplier agreement was legitimate. But Caldwell had been working narcotics interdiction in Northeast Ohio for 11 years, and something about the profile felt off. A small batch supplier moving 200 units a month through a major retail chain's distribution system, structured specifically around a product category that peaked in Q4. The timing, October, synchronized precisely with the pre-Christmas inventory surge. He requested a hold on the flagged pallet. The loss prevention team placed it in a secured area and waited. Caldwell had a problem. He could feel what this was. But feeling it and proving it were different things entirely. Opening a case of bicycles without a warrant on the basis of a 12-pound weight discrepancy would not establish the probable cause necessary for a full search warrant on the Buckeye premises. Defense attorneys would shred it. He needed something harder. He spent 4 days pulling everything public on the registration. Business filings, the address, utility connections, vehicle registrations tied to the principals. What he found was thin: a Ravenna address, a registered agent who appeared to be a nominee, and 2 phone numbers tracing to prepaid devices with no established history. The cell had insulated the front well. What Caldwell needed was an independent look at the product, something that could withstand a warrant application. The break came not from surveillance or human intelligence, but from a physics test. Caldwell consulted with a materials engineer from the Ohio State Highway Patrol's forensic unit. The engineer's assessment, a standard BMX-style bicycle frame, constructed from carbon steel tubing, has a predictable magnetic response. It is ferromagnetic. A handheld rare earth magnet placed against an unmodified frame will cling with a specific measured force that correlates with wall thickness. If the interior of the tube contains a non-ferrous mass, fentanyl powder is essentially non-magnetic. The effective wall thickness reads differently. The magnet's response shifts in a detectable way. This was not a formal analytical method. It had no established precedent in Ohio case law. But it was also not a search. Running a magnet along the exterior of a case someone is authorized to examine in loss prevention review did not require a warrant. Caldwell called the loss prevention supervisor. He explained what he needed. She authorized the examination of one case from the held pallet under the facility's internal review process. On December 14, 2025, an OSHP forensic technician ran a rare earth magnet along the exterior of one bicycle frame through the cardboard of an opened case. The response was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, subtly wrong. The kind of wrong that a trained engineer measures in millitesla differential and translates into a wall thickness discrepancy of approximately 2 to 3 millimeters across a 20-centimeter test run. 2 to 3 millimeters replicated consistently along both the seat tube and the top tube of the same frame. The technician documented the finding. Caldwell filed his warrant application the same afternoon. The application was specific: 1 frame, 1 facility, a non-invasive magnetic test on an authorized subject, yielding a measurable anomaly consistent with concealed mass in a hollow tube product. The materials engineer's affidavit ran 6 pages. The judge signed it in under an hour. One detail kept pulling at me in the warrant file. The affidavit was careful to note that the magnet test was not confirmatory for any specific substance. Caldwell did not tell the judge what he believed was inside the tubes. He told the judge there was an anomaly that warranted a destructive examination of 1 frame. That restraint was deliberate. He wanted a clean warrant, not one based on a conclusion he could not yet prove. Prosecutors would later describe it as textbook. On December 16th, a DEA technician using a hand torch cut through the weld seam on 1 seat tube from the examined frame, in the presence of 2 DEA agents, an OSHP forensic officer, and Caldwell. The brick slid out clean. White powder. Vacuum sealed in heavy gauge clear plastic. Standard pharmaceutical format brick geometry. Field tested on site. Positive for fentanyl. 11 kilograms. 1 bike. Caldwell called his DEA contact at the Cleveland field office at 11:47 that morning. The case had just changed shape. 1 frame contained 11 kilograms of fentanyl. The cell had moved approximately 600 bikes across 3 shipments since October. If even a fraction of those frames carried comparable loads, the volume in the Ravenna operation was substantial enough to qualify as major distribution. The downstream network this product was feeding was an open question, one that needed answering before they moved on the garage. But they also had a clock problem. The 3rd pallet remained in the Youngstown warehouse. The hold could not remain indefinitely without triggering a query from Buckeye. If the cell flagged that a delivery had not been processed normally, they might pull back or relocate. The DEA had 9 days. The Cleveland field office stood up a joint operation immediately. Caldwell's drug unit retained primary investigative authority. DEA brought technical surveillance capability and federal warrant jurisdiction. OSHP assigned a K-9 unit and a tactical element. The operation was kept within a tight compartment, fewer than 14 people with full awareness at any point. Here is where it got complicated. Surveillance of the garage established within 48 hours that the premises were active 6 days a week. 2 primary occupants, Delgado and Reardon, ran daily operations. A third individual, Cruz, appeared at irregular intervals, arriving in a vehicle registered to an address in Akron, spending between 1 and 4 hours on site, and departing. Cruz's pattern suggested a supervisory role. He was not listed in the business registration. The surveillance team ran 2 vehicles in rotating coverage across the 9-day window. One staged near a commercial laundromat 2 blocks west. A second staged near a small grocery on the cross street to the east. Each position offered a sight line to the garage's front approach without requiring a vehicle to sit static on the residential block itself. A stationary car on a quiet cul-de-sac gets noticed in 3 days. Rotating coverage kept the surveillance invisible. What the team observed in those 9 days was routine. Delgado arrived each morning between 8 and 9. He unlocked the rolling door, raised it to working height, and within 20 minutes, the sound of power tools, an angle grinder, and occasionally a welder, was audible from the street. Reardon typically arrived an hour later. The 2 worked through the day with minimal interruption. They took a lunch break around noon. A food delivery vehicle arrived twice during the observation window, a different service each day. Neither left the premises during working hours. They were disciplined in a way that suggested they had been trained to maintain a consistent pattern. Deviations attract attention. Routine is camouflage. Cruz's visits were different. He arrived without a fixed schedule, always in the same vehicle, always alone. He entered through the personnel door on the south wall rather than the main rolling door. His arrivals did not trigger any change in the sound of work from inside. He would be on site for 1 to 4 hours, and when he left, his departures were equally unremarkable. The team documented 9 Cruz visits across the 9-day window. On 4 of those visits, he arrived carrying a bag and left without it. On 2 visits, the reverse. He arrived without a visible bag and left carrying one. The investigators assessed these exchanges as likely financial or logistical in nature. Cruz was moving something in and out of the operation on a schedule that did not correspond to the production cycle. Caldwell needed to understand the downstream network before taking the garage. If the cell had already distributed product from the first 3 shipments into multiple cities, arresting the Ravenna principals without mapping those distribution points would leave the actual narcotics already in circulation and the downstream buyers intact. The DEA's Chicago and Cleveland field offices had no existing intelligence on fentanyl in bicycle frames. The method was novel enough that there were no prior interdiction files to cross-reference. Put yourself in Caldwell's position. You have confirmed fentanyl in a concealed shipment. You have a garage full of product. You have a 9-day window. And you have no map of where the product already distributed has gone. The decision to proceed without fully mapping the downstream network was not made lightly. Caldwell's position, documented in the operational brief, each additional day of surveillance was a day the garage continued producing finished frames. The risk of losing the principals, particularly Cruz, whose movements suggested he operated across multiple locations, outweighed the intelligence gap. Arrest the cell, seize the active inventory, and let prosecutors use the cooperation process to work backward into the downstream distribution. DEA concurred. The operation was set for January 19, 2026, 6 weeks after the initial magnet test. That timeline had to compress. On January 14th, Cruz arrived at the garage and did not leave. He was present the following day as well. Surveillance noted an increase in activity, additional vehicle traffic, what appeared to be an accelerated production pace. The welding jigs showed more active frames than any prior observation. Either the cell was pushing to complete a 4th shipment, or something had signaled them to move faster. The possibility that the operation had been partially compromised, that the held pallet had somehow telegraphed back, was on the table. The surveillance team assessed the probability as low but non-zero. Caldwell moved the raid to January 17th. In the 48 hours before the operation, the DEA's technical unit conducted a final sweep of the surveillance infrastructure. The pole camera on the utility line was confirmed operational. A second camera, a small fixed unit mounted inside a decommissioned electrical junction box on the alley fence, provided coverage of the garage's rear fire door and the alley exit. Both feeds were monitored in real time from a command post established in a rented commercial space 8 blocks from the cul-de-sac. On January 16th, the command post was staffed continuously from 6 p.m. forward. Agents ate in shifts. Nobody left. At 10:40 p.m. on January 16th, the thermal feed showed a 3rd heat signature enter the garage from the south personnel door. Cruz. His vehicle was logged at curbside. By midnight, all 3 signatures were stationary inside. The entry team lead confirmed the intelligence at 12:15 a.m. and passed it to Caldwell. All 3 principals in a single location. The operation held. For the 5 hours between midnight and 5 a.m., the command post sat quiet. Agents checked equipment. The K9 handler worked his dog through a brief exercise pattern in the parking lot behind the rented space to keep the animal calibrated for a cold morning deployment. The forensic team inventoried their cutting equipment a second time. Caldwell sat with the operational brief open on a tablet and read it through twice. Not because he had missed anything, because reading it again was the only thing left to do while the clock moved toward 5:43. The 5-day compression was the right call. The decision to proceed without a complete downstream map was also right. Waiting for perfect intelligence in a narcotics investigation is not caution. It is the kind of institutional hesitation that lets networks relocate. The product already distributed was already distributed. The 400+ kilograms potentially still in the garage were not. The Portage County Drug Unit, the DEA Cleveland Field Office, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol established their operational order on January 16th. Entry team, 12 agents from DEA and the Drug Unit, stacked at the garage's rolling steel door and a secondary personnel door on the south wall. K9 unit positioned at the alley exit with 2 OSHP officers. Perimeter vehicles blocking both ends of the cul-de-sac. A DEA forensic unit in a separate vehicle at the curb, equipped with documentation equipment and the cutting torch. The raid window was pre-dawn, 5:45 a.m. Thermal surveillance the prior evening had placed Delgado inside the garage as late as 11 p.m. Cruz's vehicle was confirmed parked in front. Reardon's vehicle was not visible. His whereabouts were unconfirmed. The operational brief noted this as an open variable. Plans for the building were current. Entry points were mapped. But Reardon's location was unknown at the time the order was given. Real operations carry real gaps. The 6 vehicles turned onto the cul-de-sac at 5:43 a.m. on January 17, 2026. No lights. Engines below idle. Temperature 29 degrees. The entry team reached the rolling steel door at 5:44. The breach was simultaneous at both the main door and the south personnel entrance. The rolling door took 4 seconds. Delgado was found prone on the garage floor, 7 feet inside the main entrance. He had apparently been sleeping on a folded moving blanket directly on the concrete, positioned near the base of the wall rack where the finished frames hung. He offered no resistance. He was secured and moved to the exterior within 90 seconds. Cruz was in the back of the garage, near the welding jigs, and he made it as far as the rear fire door. The K-9 unit had the alley covered. Cruz cleared the fire door, crossed the alley, crossed a neighboring property, and entered a detached tool shed approximately 40 meters from the garage perimeter. The K-9 tracked him through the frozen ground cover, working the scent line across 2 properties in under 6 minutes. The dog moved without hesitation, nose low, working the frost-covered grass in a tight pattern, the handler running alongside in the dark. The handler gave Cruz the command. He complied. The tool shed took him 43 feet from where he started. He was in custody by 5:51 a.m. Inside the garage, 41 finished frames on the wall rack, each powder-coated, price-tagged, and ready for palletization. 17 additional frames on the welding jigs at various stages of completion, some with tubes open, some sealed and ground but not yet painted. The 5-gallon paint booth still warm. On the workbench near the jigs, measuring equipment, a vacuum seal apparatus, and 7 bricks of fentanyl powder not yet loaded into frames. Each brick individually packaged. The forensic unit cataloged them one by one. The DEA welder, working at the evidence table set up in the driveway, cut into 1 finished frame from the wall rack at 6:22 a.m. The frame had been selected at random. The seat tube opened on the first cut. The brick came out intact, undamaged. 11 kilograms. Same as the frame from Youngstown. The forensic team worked through the next 4 hours. Each finished frame on the wall rack was documented before destructive examination. Not all were opened on site. The warrant authorized a sample protocol, with remaining frames transported sealed to the DEA's Cleveland Evidence Facility. At 7:58 a.m., with the garage secured and evidence collection underway, the duty supervisor at the drug unit made a call to the county prosecutor's office. Reardon's vehicle had appeared at 6:40 a.m. 2 blocks from the cul-de-sac, engine running. Reardon, the 3rd principal, whose location had been the open variable in the operational brief, had apparently been running an errand when the raid went in. He pulled up to within 2 blocks of the garage, likely saw the federal vehicles, and stopped. He was still in the vehicle when a county detective intercepted him at 6:42. He did not attempt to flee. He was sitting with both hands visible on the steering wheel when the detective reached the driver's side window. He did not speak. The detective would later note that Reardon looked less like a man who had been caught than like a man who had known, on some level, that this was coming, and had run out of time to decide what to do about it. All 3 principals were in federal custody by 7 a.m. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio convened a grand jury within 3 days of the raid. Indictments on all 3 principals were returned within the week on charges that included conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, possession with intent to distribute fentanyl, and money laundering. The weight of fentanyl recovered from the garage on January 17th, counting the 7 bricks on the workbench, the frames opened on site, and the laboratory analysis of the remaining sealed frames transported to Cleveland, came to approximately 468 kilograms. At the street-level distribution price for fentanyl powder in Northeast Ohio at the time, 468 kilograms represented a street value in the range of $14 to $18 million. That was the active inventory in the garage alone. The 3 prior shipments, approximately 600 bikes moved between October and December 2025, represented an estimated 660 kilograms of fentanyl distributed into the Northeast Corridor before anyone noticed the weight on a pallet. Federal prosecutors noted that as of the date of indictment, the downstream distribution network for those 600-plus kilograms had not been fully mapped. They had transaction-level data from the retail distribution system showing where the pallets had been routed. They did not yet have the buyer network that had taken the product from the distribution chain's endpoint to street level. That investigation was ongoing. The operational name the DEA assigned to the Ravenna investigation was deliberately unremarkable. A two-letter prefix and a case number. The kind of designation that would not surface in a search, would not draw attention in a database, and would not tip anyone off watching federal case filings. The agents named the operation for administrative tracking, not for press releases. Cruz's Akron address was executed on a simultaneous warrant on the morning of January 17th. The search found financial records, 2 prepaid phones with contact lists that DEA analysts began working immediately, and a ledger written in shorthand that required 3 days of analysis to decode. The ledger appeared to document production volumes and delivery schedules across what looked like multiple operational phases. Whether those phases represented past activity at Ravenna alone, or indicated prior or parallel operations at different locations, was a question federal investigators had not resolved at the time of indictment. The Akron address itself was a rented room in a 2-story house subdivided into short-term rentals. Cruz had been there for 5 months. He paid in cash, through a third party, and had given the landlord a name that did not match any state or federal identification record the DEA could locate. The room contained a laptop with a wiped drive, a fireproof document bag holding nothing but a single prepaid debit card with a 0 balance, and a fold-out cot positioned against the interior wall, away from the windows. He had been living in a way that left as little trace as possible. The financial records found at the address were handwritten, folded into a manila envelope, and tucked inside the lining of a winter coat hanging in the closet. The analyst found the coat on the second pass through the room. The first pass had missed it. The retail chain's loss prevention team cooperated fully with the investigation. Internal records showed that the weight variance Marcus flagged was the first anomaly in 37 Buckeye deliveries. The prior 36 had cleared without issue. Whether the third shipment's weight variance was a calibration error by the cell or an intentional probe of the warehouse's protocols, prosecutors did not specify. What the retail chain's internal records did show, when forensic accountants examined the full supplier history, was that Buckeye's payment terms had been unusual from the start. The standard agreement called for net 30 payment on delivered inventory. Buckeye negotiated net 15. The purchasing team approved the deviation without flagging it. Smaller suppliers sometimes needed faster payment cycles. In retrospect, the faster payment cycle served a different purpose. It accelerated the movement of money through the legitimate retail channel and back to Buckeye, providing a mechanism for laundering proceeds through verifiable commercial transactions. The invoices were real. The products were delivered. The payment was documented. A fraction of the narcotics revenue was being cleaned through a children's bicycle supplier agreement with a regional discount retail chain. The retail chain's standard intake process, weigh at pallet level, scan, stage, is structurally insufficient for a supply chain that has become a vector for bulk narcotics concealment. The cell did not exploit a gap left by DEA or CBP. They exploited a gap that exists in every regional distribution hub in the country. Fixing that is not a law enforcement problem. It is an industry standards problem. Marcus, the pallet-jack operator whose instinct flagged the variance at 2:17 a.m., was never named in any document filed with the court. He was not identified in the federal indictment, the press release issued by the U.S. Attorney's Office, or any subsequent media coverage. He received no formal recognition and sought none. He worked his next shift the following night. His name does not appear on paper. The retail chain adjusted its intake variance threshold for one specific supplier code before the end of January. No other operational change was announced. Here is what remains open. The 660 kilograms distributed between October and December 2025 moved through a legitimate retail chain into at least 6 states. The DEA's downstream investigation, working backward from the retailer's distribution records and forward from Cruz's ledger, had produced leads as of the indictments, but had not yet produced arrests of the buyer network that received the product. Those individuals, wherever they are in the Northeast Corridor, were never identified in the public record. The logistical knowledge that designed the concealment, the specific understanding of how seasonal bicycle inventory moved through regional cross-dock facilities, the weight calibration that accounted for the drug load in the manifest figures, did not originate in Ravenna. Caldwell's operational brief noted this explicitly. The cell in the garage was an execution node. The design of the system, and whoever built it, sits further up the chain. Federal prosecutors indicated the investigation was continuing. The garage on the cul-de-sac is shuttered. The sign that said Buckeye Cycle Resale has been removed. The retail chain's supplier agreement was terminated. The distribution channel through which the bikes traveled, the same channel that moves Christmas inventory to discount stores across 6 states, is still operating. Same routes, same cross-dock facilities, same intake protocols, adjusted at one supplier code. One pallet-jack operator noticed 12 pounds. That is where this case begins. The supply chain that made it possible still exists.